I'm going through a lot of emotions right now because of this. When we started the Union of Nova Scotia Indians in 1969, we were not heard by the governments or by Canadians, Nova Scotians. We were not known about. We'll say that. We won't say that we were being held underwater so nobody would see us or hear us. But today, everyone, at least in Nova Scotia, is realizing that there is another culture here that has always been here. And when we talk with them, we say that we will always be here. We are indigenous to this land that you show on the map. We are part of it. And our culture and our elders teach us that we're part of this land and everything in it. They don't teach us that we hold dominion over it all and all the animals and every living thing. We're part of it. So when I see something like this, after almost 50 years, I'm pretty happy. We are finally being heard and being seen as a Mi'kmaq people, a Mi'kmaq nation. We've never had all the tools that are used in today's governments, but we ran a government, and we still do. The Mi'kmaq Grand Council is the government of the Mi'kmaq people, and still is today. In order to make ourselves heard and be seen, in 1969, we began an organization called the Union of Nova Scotia Indians to research our treaty and Aboriginal rights, and eventually to take those issues to the court. And show that treaties existed. And when we did that, the Canadian courts, the Supreme Court of Canada, told the rest of Canada that Mi'kmaq treaties did exist, and they were still valid in the 1980s as treaties. We had a deal, and the deal is still good. Even though the governments tried to back out of those deals. In our own language, the word for treaty is ankugamkewe. To me, that represents a joining, a bringing in of others. So when the British treaties started out by saying we would be British subjects, just like British subjects, we were saying you guys were going to be just like us, now that we're signing treaties. And nobody ever listened to that. So if you have an open mind and look at documents like those treaties, then you must understand that the treaties are not just British. They're between two different cultures, two different peoples with their own languages. So those treaties are as much yours as they are ours. But until the 1970s in Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq were the only ones who treasured those treaties, who still knew about them, who still talked about them. And we had to go to your courts and let wiser people look at them and begin to understand them and say to Canadians, these treaties are good. These treaties are still law, and they are now in Canada. Our treaties and Aboriginal rights are part of the Canadian Constitution. It says so in Section 35 of that Constitution. We have been a federal responsibility since 1867, when Canada put in its Constitution Section 91(24) of that Constitution, saying that Canada would be responsible for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. But I suppose for them, that ended that issue. They did legislate for us. They came out with the Indian Act. But I remember 5 or 6 years ago talking with a Nova Scotia politician who at the time was bragging that he was involved in Canada's first terrorism act, in legislating that. And I had to argue with him afterwards, took him aside and said, that's not Canada's first terrorism act. The Indian Act is Canada's first terrorism act. You know, and you just have to look at what it does, what it legislates. You know, and during the war, they did the same thing to the Japanese in Canada. So Canada's first terrorism act was the Indian Act. That's what they called it. A total misnomer, not that everybody knows. We're not from India. We're from here. It's everybody else that's not from here. And we still lay claim to the title to all of Nova Scotia. No matter what title the government puts on it, any piece of land in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq title underlies that. It's never been erased. We've never sold the land. We've never traded it for anything. We've never given it up. You can't find any evidence anywhere that we did. You know, and one king in England drew up a proclamation that was sent to Canada. And in his proclamation of 1763, he stated that all the land still belongs to the Indians unless you bargain with them and purchase it, pay them for it. In Nova Scotia, never happened. You can root through all the archives in Nova Scotia and you will never find anywhere where the land was purchased by the colonial governors the way it was supposed to. Back in 1969, we started out saying to the government that we had treaties that needed to be looked at. Some of them told us that any treaties we found were not worth the paper they were written on. Back in 1969. But today we all know that they're recognized by Canada's courts as valuable and valid documents. Documents that need to be listened to. So when I see something like this today, I start to say to myself, we've finally been heard. People are hearing us. And all we've got to say now is, let's do something about it. Don't just shuffle it away like they did with the treaties early on. Let's look at what we've got. You know, and say to yourself, they own the land, we live on it. Let's work together. We agreed we would do that. So let's work together. You know, and this course that you've developed and put on, Mr. President, it's a great one from what I hear. And in the first inning, you've hit one around the world. That's really something. You know, so let's not shut up about it. I was asked to say something about the course being important and other Mi'kmaq studies courses at CBU. The only thing that I can say is keep them in the calendar and keep teaching them. And you have to do events like this, bring in Mi'kmaq people to tell you their story, their experiences, to show you their wisdom. I mean, the other thing that we fought for at CBU since 1984 was that there is science in Mi'kmaq culture. You know, we wouldn't have survived as Mi'kmaq people if we didn't know science. We didn't call it that, but it was knowledge for survival. And that's being taught here. So if nothing else, we've got the smartest university in Nova Scotia.
The country.